Congressman, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, as you know, we originally invited you on to talk about the bill that you presented to cut off aid to the war in Ukraine, and we want to spend most of the time talking about that. But as it turns out, there was an announcement today from the Biden DOJ that they will not be charging you for anything having to do with what the New York Times 2 years ago almost said that you were under investigation for. And just as a reminder, that headline of the New York Times was, quote, Matt Gaetz is set to face Justice Department inquiry over sex with an underage girl. You've had this accusatory cloud hanging over your head with no opportunity to defend yourself for almost 2 years now, and now comes the announcement 2 years later that you're not going to be charged at all, let alone convicted. What's your reaction to all of that?
Well, the announcement is not surprising, but it's certainly welcome. And at times, I think the process is the punishment. People try to smear you, say things about you that aren't true, and then hope that it distracts from the mission. And while the last 2 years haven't been the most comfortable of my life, I've been very focused on my work here in Congress, representing my constituents, and never really looking past the task at hand. And so I'm pleased with the announcement, but can't say it's a big surprise.
Well, just one last question about this, and then I want to move on. But what does it say about kind of the climate that we're living in which people are willing to assume guilt with no due process based on nothing but leaks? It's actually illegal for prosecutors to leak these sorts of things exactly for this reason. We don't know who leaked it. But clearly you've gone around now 2 years with people unjustly accusing you of this. What do you think, what lessons do you think we ought to learn from the fact that you won't end up ever being charged, let alone convicted?
Well, the lesson I learned is that God doesn't give us anything that we can't handle. But it is troubling when powerful entities in media and government try to take you off the chessboard with false accusations. And they hope that the accusation is so searing that even though it's not supported by facts, that it can still derail opportunities to serve, and in my particular case, to oversee the precise activities of the Department of Justice and the FBI. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. That's part of my work here in Congress. It's one of the things I focus on. It's one of the things I focused on during my first term when they were working to impeach President Trump over the Russia hoax. And it was a little surreal today, Glenn, that as I got this news from my attorneys, I was literally sitting in a transcribed interview of an FBI whistleblower there complaining to the Judiciary Committee with allegations that the FBI had upscaled anything that could be categorized domestic violence extremism, allegations that the FBI was not following its own rules and practice when it came to January 6th defendants. And so to be there in an oversight role and then getting this news, I don't know, maybe it opened up a wormhole somewhere.
Yeah, there's a reason due process is guaranteed in the Constitution and has been a value since the Enlightenment, because people abuse their power to accuse others, to take out political enemies and the like. And so I think we see the reason why that right is so important. So let's move on to this bill you have pending, along with 10 of your colleagues in the House, I believe, who have co-signed it, to essentially cut off further aid to the war in Ukraine. The United States has allocated already over $100 billion in various forms of aid for that war. What is the reason you introduced this bill? What's the rationale behind it?
Well, first, it's a lot of money. $100 billion would be enough to secure the entire United States from Chinese cyber attacks. But instead, we've chosen to play in this war in Europe to such an extreme degree. Second, I think it should be principally Europe's obligation and responsibility, because it's Europe's interests that are most directly impacted. And you're just creating the conditions for yet another forever war if the United States is pouring cash into a faraway land over a historically corrupt country, hoping that that's somehow going to lead to like the liberation of a Jeffersonian democracy. While you've got Germany and others in Europe buying so much Russian energy, it seems a little bizarre that the United States would participate to such a level. I also think that we are extending the violence. We are extending the carnage. No one wants to see this war on go another day. And yet, when we continue to send these enhanced munitions and weapon systems, I think that we do make the likelihood for a longer war increase. Also, I'm not sure that we're following our own laws and our own regulations regarding monitoring of materiel that is sent into an area of hostilities. In law, we have requirements for ensuring that that U.S. equipment doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Each and every step has to be documented and reported. And I've become increasingly concerned that we're not even following those laws, and we just throw our hands up and say, well, we just have to do this for the sake of democracy. And in my time here in government, I guess on the planet Earth, sometimes I get most worried in these explosions of unity, because they always seem to lead to the worst things we do, right? There was so much unity after 9/11 that we needed the Patriot Act, and then we quite literally saw it turned against patriots and turned inward against Americans for political purposes. And then there was all this unity over COVID, and it led to some of the most egregious lockdowns. And then there was unity after the George Floyd death, that everybody had to come together and embrace, the BLM movement. And if you didn't, you were shouted down a racist. And I saw that same dynamic play out around Ukraine, where you just had to be for sending anything that would shoot, in the words of Ben Sass. And if you weren't for that, somehow you believed less in American democracy or American interests.
Yeah, so you know the arguments. So let me ask you about the two principal ones wielded against people like you who say maybe the U.S. doesn't need to fund and fuel this proxy war into all of eternity. The first is that Russia is an enemy of the United States, and through this war we're able to weaken an enemy of our country without having to send troops there or risk the lives of American citizens. We're just paying in order to weaken a major adversary, and that's a good deal. And the second one is, if you cut off funding to the Ukrainians, as your bill suggests we should, then Russia will simply overrun the country, will conquer land, will annex what they want, and I guess that's a bad thing for Ukraine, and the argument goes for the world as well. What are your responses to those two claims?
So I reject the premise of the first claim that somehow this is something we do in the absence of risk to Americans. Our country just lost a 20-year war to goat herders with rifles in Afghanistan. And I'm supposed to believe that Americans aren't at risk when we go poke a nuclear power with a madman in charge. If you accept the premise of the neocons, Putin is this crazy madman, well then why would we be in a situation where we would truly greater risk to our fellow Americans than however the skirmish person gets to run crime probably doesn't pose the same risk to Americans as sending weapon systems into Ukraine and into disputed territories in eastern Ukraine on the border of Russia, where they're launching deep into Russian territory to strike Russian assets and Russian supply chains. That is precisely the ecosystem that leads to escalation that's a risk to our fellow Americans. And the second, or the notion that, well, just like they're an enemy, so we want the enemy weaker. Isn't that like what got us into Vietnam? America's very costly interventionism is usually driven by this debunked theory of geopolitics that if we play out a series of proxy wars by borrowing money from one country to send it to another, that we somehow improve our global standing. Seems to do pretty well for the defense contractors and the elites, but I'm not sure that advances the interests of the people like the farmers in my district who rely on Russian satellite technology for seed planting, or they rely on fertilizer from Belarus. They're not doing better as a result of this. They're actually paying a price for it, a price that is far higher than just the cash that the U.S. government prints off, but in terms of the inflationary impact on their lives and their energy and their prospects. And what was the second argument?
Well, no, so yeah, you addressed both of them, that Russia will take over and conquer, Ukraine if we cut off aid, and that we're getting to weaken an adversary with no lives at risk. Do you have anything to add to those? I feel like you addressed those, but if you want to...
I want Ukraine to prevail, but shouldn't Germany want that more than the United States? Shouldn't these European powers that use their money to facilitate socialism, and then they want us to go and subsidize their defense, all the while they're critical of us? That makes us dead money at the world stage, not a meaningful impact player.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that these countries, so many of the ones to whom we give aid or to whom we provide protection, beginning with Germany, have given to their citizens a way better standard of living than a huge number of American citizens are able to get. And we're spending our resources to further enrich those countries, to protect those countries, to relieve them of their obligations while our citizens suffer. So you mentioned the people who are benefiting, which is not people in your district. I bet you could go around to a town hall in every district and not one person would say the thing they worry about when they wake up in the morning is who is ruling the Donbass or eastern Ukrainian provinces. But you did mention people who are benefiting, and those are arms dealers. I remember in the House Armed Services Committee where you served, the debate during the Trump administration where you were arguing the best day to get out of Afghanistan is today, the next best, or yesterday, the next best day is today. You ended up losing that debate. The House Armed Services Committee blocked President Trump from withdrawing, but we did end up withdrawing, finally, during the Biden years, the first year of the Biden administration. And then it's kind of amazing that 6 to 8 months later, the arms industry gets this brand new war that is a brand new, very lucrative market for all of their weapons that they lost when we finally got out of Afghanistan. Do you mark that up to coincidence, or do you think that at least part of the reason we keep finding wars to fuel is because these arms manufacturers have so much power in Washington and benefit so much when we do?
I'll say it explicitly. I do not believe we would have our level of involvement in Ukraine at where it currently stands if it were not for the drawdown in our activities in Afghanistan. These defense contractors need tens of millions of dollars in new programs every month just to justify their overhead. They're that big. And so you've got a situation where the supply and demand economy really works against global peace and against the interests of Americans, because the demand is the demand to have somewhere to send these weapons. And so the supply, then you get a circumstance where policymakers are trying to generate areas that justify it. And it's not only in areas of hostilities. Now you're seeing a lot of that same incentive structure play out, where folks roll up to the Hill and give us briefings insisting, oh, all of our stockpiles have been depleted. We've sent everything to Ukraine. All of our stockpiles have been depleted. Well, what does that do? That generates a whole new round of business on the initiative of refilling our stockpiles, when the reality is we didn't need to send a lot of this stuff over there anyway. And it's quite humorous, Glenn, if you don't mind me saying, when I get on these phone calls with a lot of these Ukrainian defense officials and they start reading off the list of shit that they want, they don't even know how to use a bunch of this stuff. I know that there's just somebody who went and bribed them to make those requests. And a lot of this stuff doesn't even get into the fight. And the defense contractors don't care. They just want to be able to make it, mark it up, and sell it. And then they hire these third parties to go bribe Ukrainian officials to go then make the demands on U.S. policymakers. And it's debasing to watch a lot of my colleagues leap over one another to be the first to insist that they be given everything on the list, regardless of the capabilities that exist to operate it effectively.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.